Having taken the pulse of the community, I know this video will be a hot take, which is surprising to me, but I believe it signifies to us that the writing of Clair Obscur is creative, thoughtful, and intentional. Now, I'm just gonna say it and we can get into it. I am certain that Maelle's ending is the correct choice. Allow me to elucidate this notion and provide a comprehensive case for why I feel so strongly about this. I want to start with the most critical component of my argument, which is the center which everything else revolves around. Without this component, everything falls apart. And the component I'm referring to is how we define the world inside the canvas. Is it real? I believe wholeheartedly in my soul that we should consider the world within the canvas as a real world. I know that a lot of people have differing opinions on this component of the story, but think about it this way. Let's say your homie or your girl or your man or anything in between comes up to you one day and they say, "Yo fam, I want to confide in you. This world isn't real. I created the whole thing as my own playground essentially, and the real world is the world outside that I come from. There are other worlds like this, and certain people from my world have the talent to make them at will." Outside of the personal emotional impacts, would that actually change anything for you? It wouldn't. You don't have the license to act any differently or commit crimes or do whatever you want just because your friend made you privy to this knowledge. Our world would still function the exact same before and after your friend confided in you. People would still exist, your relationships and familial bonds would still exist, the value of them wouldn't change. For example, if it were me specifically having these revelations, I wouldn't look at my 1.5-year-old son and think to myself, well, I guess he doesn't matter anymore. And so it would be extremely disingenuous if in the next breath your friend said, "Yeah, you and your life actually don't mean anything and nobody in this world has any value. I am the only person who matters." You wouldn't accept that. So if you wouldn't accept that our world and our people don't matter in this hypothetical, why is it that players so readily accept the idea that Lumiere and its people aren't actually real people? To draw another parallel for my religious folk out there, this scenario is like if your friend revealed that he was actually God and then said he was going to erase you and everything you care about because to him, nothing in your world is actually real. Would you readily accept that your entire existence is fake and non-consequential? If not, then why would you do so with Lumiere and his people? Being cognizant of the creator does not invalidate the value or authenticity of the created. Many people who walk this earth believe in a higher power. The existence of a higher power does not deem our lives inconsequential. So I don't believe it should for the people of Lumiere. Just because the creators in this context are central characters in the narrative does not make the created irrelevant. Our familiarity with the creators does not invalidate the value of the created. And this framework leads directly into my next point. If we apply an objective moral calculus to this situation, then the answer becomes even more clear. In Maelle's ending, we save an entire world full of not only humans but different species and interconnected cultures. In Verso's ending, we sacrifice the entire world of said beings for one family. We're talking about one family against thousands or millions of souls, if I had to guess what the scope of the canvas is. And here's the thing, the only thing that is a surety in Verso's ending is that he gets what he wants, an immediate death. There's no guarantee that destroying the canvas somehow ensures a seamless reconciliation and immediate unity for Maelle's family. In fact, I would argue that the ending shows us that it is likely that the family is no better off. In Verso's ending, we don't see anybody show any affection or care for Maelle. Not a single character reaches out to her, which shows that Maelle truly is alone and blamed in this world, in spite of all of the things that her family has gone through in the canvas. Nothing has changed. And I don't believe we have any assurance that anything would change. After all, as Renoir alludes to, he spent 67 years in the canvas. Time moves differently there. That means Aline also spent 67 years there. If after 67 years they are still this self-absorbed and still not willing to empathize with their youngest daughter and release her from the guilt of her part in Verso's death, I genuinely don't have any faith in the long run that Maelle can expect any authentic or unconditional support from her family. Which isn't even to mention Clea, who outright says everything was Maelle's fault and that if the situation arose again, she would let Maelle die instead of sacrifice her life for hers. Juxtapose Maelle's family with the people of Lumiere. In spite of having an extremely limited time to live, Gustave and his sister take in Maelle even though she's a street orphan who goes from family to family because she is essentially a problem child. They give her unconditional love and raise her with a perpetual consideration. When Expedition 33 hits the island and they're decimated by the then unstoppable force that is Canvas Renoir, in spite of the fact that countless loved ones died in an unbelievably traumatic event, in spite of the fact he's clearly in shock and not built for this life, Gustav has a single-minded determination to find Maelle and ensure her safety after Lune walks him back from despair. The dogmatic Lune is willing to throw protocol to the wind just to support Gustav in finding Maelle. We see Ciel go out of her way to constantly emotionally support Maelle and look after her. I believe it's important to acknowledge these facts. We spent a 40-hour journey with these characters, and that journey gives me enough belief and context to be certain that the likes of Gustav, Lune, and Ciel would work extremely hard as constant moral barometers for Maelle in the long run and keep her grounded. If you notice, upon learning the truth from Maelle about what she is relative to the world state of the canvas, Ciel and Lune don't treat her any differently at all. And I do want to briefly note here for the theorists who suggest that the Lumierans, if you will, who are resurrected in the last part of the game aren't the same as before or aren't their authentic original selves. I believe there's sufficient evidence to suggest that they are their authentic original selves. There are relationship scenes between Verso and Lune and Ciel in which Lune and Ciel divulge information that Maelle would have had no way of knowing about. Ciel also converses with SKA about her drowning incident and her husband, and Maelle would have had no way of knowing about that interaction between Ciel and SKA either, as it takes Ciel the entire game to piece together her connection with SKA. Additionally, we see in game that Maelle can identify residual chroma specifically belonging to the Gommage to Ciel and Lune, so we can assume that she would do the same with the rest of the Lumerians. There is also no precedent for painters mind controlling their creations. Clair is shown to be a far superior painter to Maelle, and the best she can do is paint over creations, which is what we see with Simon and the painted Clair. But no whim-based mind control. So it's a leap to suggest that Maelle, who is universally acknowledged as the worst painter by far in the family, would somehow possess this power set that outscales everybody else's, including her mother, who is the leader of the Painters Council. So to continue with that established, I believe that Gustav, Lune, and Ciel would be stalwart positive influences on Maelle and would help her immensely in processing her trauma. After all, Gustav has already helped Maelle process the trauma of her difficult upbringing and existence. Prior to her regaining her memories, he's her brother father, or at least the one that truly puts her and her well-being above everything else. This is most obviously showcased in the fact that Gustav literally sacrifices his life just so that Maelle may live. I believe that her Lumiere people would also be considerate to the fact that Maelle needs to find balance for her well-being and that she should step out now and again to visit her parents. I know Maelle suggests that the canvas will be erased the moment she leaves by her dad, but we are also shown that they can see what's happening inside the canvas from the outside. Maelle can communicate from the inside to ensure that this isn't the case, but of course the best way to build Renoir's trust would be to work on herself and successfully process her grief. Lumiere is the best place for that. And I want to note that because people suggest Verso's ending is the best ending for Maelle in her processing of her grief. I'm sorry, in what way is stripping her of her family and loved ones and thrusting her headfirst into a newly disabled life with no support system the best for her? And no support system is a nice way of putting it. How about a system of people who actively blame you for their family's worst experience ever? We can see this because Clair says as much, and is telling that Maelle's mother paints her as she is post-tragedy, not as she was originally. Renoir is the only one making an effort to treat Maelle humanely, but even then, that on its own isn't enough. And for the record, Renoir recognizes that it's for the best that she stays in the canvas. As Verso points out, he noticed Maelle's deception at the moment when she said just a little bit longer. But what Verso fails to realize, or what he realizes and doesn't care about, is that Renoir noticed this and still left her there, because Renoir concluded rightly that it was for the best. I think he made the same calculation that thrusting her out would be an irreparable fracture to their relationship and her well-being, but if he let her stay there, there was hope in the future that they could mend things, and most importantly, that she could mend herself. And for me, Renoir's conclusion of what's best for Maelle holds way more weight than Verso's. After all, that's his youngest daughter, his hidden star. Verso is not actually Maelle's brother. He doesn't have the same emotional investment in her as her Lumiere family or Renoir. Clair says outright before Maelle enters the canvas that she would do well to remember that that isn't actually Verso. And how could he be? His lived experience was harsh and unique, and his routinely selfish actions are a byproduct of that. To continue, I would argue that allowing her to grieve on her own time amongst loved ones who have showed up for her time and time again, who earnestly want what's best for her, is absolutely what's best for Maelle. And in the long run, I believe what is best for Maelle is also what is best for the Dessendre family. Clair is self-sufficient and self-absorbed, and her parents are wholly focused on how Verso's death affects them and the family, and not with Maelle's feelings. I should also include a stipulation here. The Dessendre family is partly justified in the lack of support that they are giving Maelle. While we don't know the full extent of it, they are literally at war with a faction called the Writers, of course, and Maelle's mother is the head of the Painters Council. In many ways, that seems to be a dire war for survival considering it took the real Verso's life, so it is partly understandable that they don't have the bandwidth to guide Maelle through her trauma. They seem to have a ton of social responsibility and leadership responsibilities in the real world that others rely on. Clair outright says that she doesn't have time to coddle anybody. If anything, this is all more justification and reason that Maelle's holistic well-being would be better off if she were to retain her Lumiere support system. This is probably one of the most vital components to my argument because I know the core of the Verso argument is the idea that Maelle and her family would be better off and this is the only way for them to move past Verso's death, but I genuinely believe that due to everything I just outlined, the family would be worse off in this ending, Maelle more than anybody else. So even if you performed your moral calculus and decided this one family was worth more than an entire world of denizens, I hate to break it to you, but even if that's the case, this one family would not be better off in Verso's ending. Maelle wouldn't have a support system or a voice, both literally and figuratively, and additionally, she would now have to grieve an entire additional family and world, not just the original Verso. Don't forget, Maelle is 16, but she's had 32 years of consciousness. If you consider when she entered the canvas, she was a literal baby. So her life in Lumiere has just as much, actually probably more emotional weight and connection than her life outside the canvas. I've seen it suggested that people think that her revelation that she is a paintress will shatter her ability to connect with others in Lumiere, and that she will eventually end up on the path to being like her mother. But that notion ignores crucial context. Like I said, she spent a whole life in Lumiere. She didn't enter it with her consciousness intact like Renoir and her mother. This allowed her to gain an emotional and social foundation as a true denizen of Lumiere, and I don't believe this foundation is shakeable. But let's do a quick hypothetical, right? Let's say that it is 100% confirmed that Verso's ending will result in the Dessendre family processing Verso's death and coalescing into a healthy family unit. Let's pretend that is 100% going to be the case. At that point, do we pick Verso's ending instead? Well, personally, I wouldn't, and here's why. This is like the trolley problem on steroids. For those who don't know, the trolley problem is a famous ethical thought experiment in moral philosophy. It presents a moral dilemma in which a runaway train is heading toward 5 people tied to a track. You can pull a lever to divert it to another track, but there's one person tied to that track. Do you pull the lever? So the idea here is that it explores the tension between utilitarianism, which is the doctrine that actions are right if they are for the benefit of a majority or maximize overall good, and deontological ethics, which emphasize the moral obligation of following rules and principles regardless of the outcome. So, utilitarianism would align with pulling the lever to save 5 people but actively kill 1 person, and deontological ethics would align with not doing anything because if you do something, you would break the most important moral rule, which is to never kill another person. So, the ending of Clair Obscur is like the trolley problem on steroids. There is the Dessendre family on one track and then every single being in the world of Lumiere on another track. Do you pull the lever and kill the Dessendre family, which is Maelle's ending, or do you leave the lever untouched and let the world die for the sake of the Dessendre family? Even if it was an absolute certainty that the Dessendre family would be reformed by Verso's ending, I personally would still pull the lever and save the world of Lumiere. So you could say my personal ethics are more aligned with utilitarianism, but here's the thing, as I've extensively covered, in reality, I don't even believe the Dessendre family would even be reformed if we were to choose Verso's ending. For me, saving Lumiere is the only route that offers hope of a positive resolution for the Dessendres. While we're discussing the holes in Verso's ending, I want to touch upon what is in my estimation the other main factor that drives people to choose Verso, and that is the fragment of the original Verso's soul, the Shadow Boy, if you will. Listen, there's no way around it. This was emotional manipulation to the highest degree. They put a boy in front of you who said he didn't want to do something anymore, and it's hard not to be wrapped up in the emotional gravitation of that moment. But if you take a deep breath and think about it logically, this also isn't close to being a sufficient argument for choosing Verso's ending. I think this connects to a central theme for why I believe Maelle's ending is for the best, and that is that it offers hope. In Verso's ending, due to things we've discussed up until now, I don't think there's any hope for a positive conclusion for Maelle's family, and of course Lumiere is erased from existence. I believe that is shown time and again throughout the story that Maelle is an extremely empathetic person, so I don't have any doubt that she would strive to ease the burden on the fragment of Verso's soul and try to make life better for him. We have to consider a big component of Verso's soul fragment being so weary is that he is just helplessly bearing witness to his parents fighting and grieving. In Maelle's world, those components would be absent, and I also believe that Maelle would use all of her powers as a paintress to make life good and warm for Verso's soul fragment. We see in the game that Verso's soul fragment isn't just solely stuck existing in that void painting. No, we encounter him throughout the game all around the world and have conversations about his thoughts and feelings. This to me shows a capacity and a potential for Verso's soul to find enjoyment, to find emotional fulfillment, to find meaningful connection within the painted world. And considering it's the only real fragment of her brother left, I know it would find immense joy in spending time with Maelle, considering the original Verso loved her so much he traded his life for hers. And I know for certain that Maelle would prioritize the fragment's well-being, which is something that we never see Verso do, by the way. Not a single time throughout the game, in spite of knowing who the Shrouded Boy is, does he offer any kind of comfort or solace or try to support him, which is in line with his character. Although he's charismatic and he is our protagonist, and we play as him, Verso is a selfish asshole. Let's take a moment to unpack why Verso is so problematic though. Like I've alluded to before, he is an extremely selfish individual. He doesn't do a single thing in the game that is for somebody who isn't himself. But he's extremely savvy. He's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Everything he does is a misdirection dressed as moral behavior. Perhaps the best example is the fact that he let Gustav die. This to me will always paint his character in an irredeemable light. He claims to care about Maelle, but he deliberately let her closest person die, just so that he could fill the void. I feel like the weight of this revelation isn't appropriately felt by players because it takes place amidst the realizations that Lumiere is a world within the canvas. Imagine if you learned this earlier, before the canvas revelation. Or even better, imagine if there's no canvas revelation. You would probably hate Verso. We need to at least collectively acknowledge that this was an extremely predatory action that Verso took. Regardless of if he feels bad about it or not afterwards, it was calculated, ruthless, and manipulative. Another example is, when Maelle releases Alicia, he lashes out in rage in spite of the fact that it's what Alicia wanted. He always thinks of himself first. He certainly had merit in saying to Maelle that he didn't get a chance to say goodbye, but I don't believe that discredits his reaction. His reaction is another showing of Verso's pattern, and that pattern is always thinking of himself and putting his needs first. Then, after that, he will try to be good, but he never ever compromises on the idea that his needs and wants come first. If you pick Verso's ending, I genuinely feel that you as a player fell victim to his signature lies and charm, and gave him what he wanted in spite of the fact it wasn't for the best. This is the thing with Verso though. How I think of Verso is that he's like a walking compliment sandwich. For those of you who don't know, the idea of a compliment sandwich is that when you have something harsh that you need to say to somebody, you basically put it in between two compliments. So, for example, if your boss needs to tell you that you need to get better at your job or you're fired, they might say, listen, I love your energy that you bring to everybody else, you're a joy to be around, but you cannot keep missing deadlines. That is becoming a detriment to the team's performance. So please work on that. Otherwise, we may have to have conversations about your future here. But I do also want to add that it doesn't go unnoticed that the work you are completing is completed adequately. So let's just work on the timing. So you can see while the core of the message is get your shit together and complete your work on time, otherwise you're fired, the blow is softened by putting it in between positive reinforcement. Compliment sandwich. This is how I think of Verso. He openly showcases raw emotion and proactively goes out of his way to have conversations with people and actively listens to others. He helps Ciel confront her fears. He goes with Minoko to bring Noko back and supports him in his grief. He shares his love of music with Lune. He tries to console Maelle throughout the game, even though he is responsible for her grief. But literally every action he takes in the game has a negative color painted over it based off what he does at the end. Everything looks like a shameful manipulation in the end. Instead of him seeming to be an empathetic person, his choices at the end retroactively paints everything he did as selfish and manipulative. Everything he did with Ciel and Lune was a gambit to gain their trust so that he could use their talents to reach his end goal and operate without suspicion. If you really study him closely with the perspective of hindsight, you can see he's just constantly emotionally manipulating and lying. A quick example is, when he is getting closer to Lune, Lune shares that her oldest brother was everyone's favorite. Verso says back that his older sister was everyone's favorite. In a later scene, Maelle is venting that she is basically the least liked or wanted child in the family. Verso then responds that she is her father's real favorite. So, which is the truth? The truth is Verso is an emotionally manipulative individual who will say or do whatever fits the moment to build a better rapport with whoever he's speaking to. And again, obviously the event that showcases this the most is the fact that he let Gustav die. A horrifying thing he did there. How could he? Well, I believe this connects back to my tangent about Maelle being born into Lumiere. As I mentioned, she authentically existed as a denizen of the world. Verso was painted into it with all of the original Verso's memories. The way he came into being automatically means that he is a viscerally different person to the man whose memory he carries. See, now, imagine this. Imagine being born into a world and feeling with every fiber of your being that your original existence was in a world outside of it. Imagine knowing the world that you're currently in was actually created by somebody in the world outside of yours. What's more, imagine that the person who made your world was the man whose memories you shared. This would obviously lead to you seeing everybody else's needs as beneath your own. After all, in a way, your mind is constantly telling you that this is your world, not anybody else's. You literally have memories of creating it. Everything else in it cannot hold the same value as your own life. Now, in a way, I do want to acknowledge that Verso is a character who is formed by his environment. I don't want to say it's not his fault, because personal responsibility is a thing, and breaking your social programming is an admirable feat that people are able to do every day. I understand that he didn't ask for this existence, but literally nobody does. None of us has to be created, yet we exist and many people are born into harsh circumstances. In my estimation, however, it's time Verso put somebody besides himself first. But alas, his programming, that he is essentially God of this world, proved to be too much to overcome for him. Had Verso been able to overcome his environmental programming and accept that everyone else had as much weight as he, and that he himself was not Verso but a separate entity with his own identity and his own right to a happy life in Lumiere, then this game would have had a happier ending. And I'd just like to add that it's actually in Maelle's ending that many of these things are affirmed about Verso. He obviously breaks down and says what is maybe the only truly honest and non-calculating thing he says in this game, and that is, I don't want this life. The weight of the original Verso's cognition and memories, the weight of feeling like this world is basically inconsequential and something he made with his own two hands, intertwined with the weight of never being able to leave. It all comes crashing down. The raw honesty of this scene reveals that Verso's goals were never to reform the family and help them, but to help himself. I do think he wanted sorely for these goals to be aligned, but in spite of that, he still wanted to put himself ahead of everyone else. And that is confirmed in the confession, I don't want this life. He doesn't cry, Maelle, you need to leave, you shouldn't be here. He cries, I don't want this life. Now, I'd like to talk more about this ending itself. So, I understand why in this moment Verso is crashing out. But in the scene in the theater, we can see that Verso is older. I've seen people online suggest that Maelle in this ending is selfishly using everyone in Lumiere as her playthings, but I feel that this would be a completely unwarranted 180 for the character, and I don't see it that way. And also, what I was saying before about her power set. I think it was a very deliberate choice to show us that Verso has aged. I believe the meaning here is that he will finally have the chance to die of natural causes. Maelle, of course, says outright as well, if you could grow old, would you find a reason to smile? And we get confirmation that Maelle is sticking to her words and commitment, sticking to her compromise with Verso to allow him to live out his days naturally and die. I'll also add that earlier in the game, Verso professed that music was his passion, and there he is, performing on stage. So, Maelle is committed to Verso finding a semblance of happiness in the final chapter of his life. Now, I know people like to assume that the implication here is that now Verso is being forced to perform for Maelle as her puppet, but honestly, I don't see it that way. I don't see him as a prisoner in this ending. I see it as now he can live out his days and die of natural causes, and whether or not he's miserable the whole time is entirely up to him. He can mope around for a few decades, or he can accept circumstances and dedicate himself to having meaningful years before his death. And here's the thing. Somebody might say, well, why doesn't Maelle show him mercy and at least erase him instead of having him alive? My response would honestly be, give me a break. Is it so much to ask that for once, just once, Verso does something for somebody else? He claims to want to help Maelle grieve, but he isn't willing to spend a few decades before dying in doing so? He can't compromise for once and do something selfless for once? Also, would these same people say, well, why didn't Verso save Gustav? Because that definitely wasn't fair. I say that to say I think given all the things she has gone through, what Maelle asks of Verso is completely fair and a worthy recompense for his actions. But what Verso asks of Maelle is not. In Verso's ending, he asks that she let the world and almost everyone she loves die. He asks that she returns to her life with no support system and no voice, her life where every moment is labored and rife with pain, all so that he can die. All Maelle asks in her ending is that he dies after a few more decades. People, logically there is a huge gulf between the costs of each ending in this game. To continue, in my view, how we see Verso in Maelle's ending is in fact him begrudgingly compromising with Maelle. To me, him playing the piano is him accepting his role and the compromise that he will finally live out his days. I believe if the contrary was true and he was truly being completely forced to play and perform for Maelle, then we would have seen her flex her powers more in this ending, or we would have seen Verso resist more and have to be forced to play, or an element of showing us that Verso had been painted over in some sort of capacity. I also believe we would have seen some sign of discomfort from Ciel, Lune, and Gustav, but if you read them, you can read contentment and joy in their faces. I don't believe we see those emotions if their precious Maelle had gone off the deep end. So, Maelle's ending is actually the one where Verso makes his sacrifice for Maelle and the family. Verso's ending is simply when he finally gets what he wants for himself, and literally everyone else be damned. Now, there's one last detail I want to touch to affirm that Maelle's ending is the correct choice, and that is the painted Alicia. So, as we know, painted Alicia was painted by Maman or Aline as an authentic representation of her real daughter, Maelle. She painted Alicia as the Alicia with all of her resulting trauma and pain from the fire that took Verso's life. So, in this narrative, it could be fair to say that the Shadow Alicia shares a unique understanding with Maelle that nobody else does. She understands what her existence outside would be like, closer than anybody else. And she asks Maelle to kill her. She chooses to die. I don't believe it's inconsequential that the game included this. I believe this is telling us that in all likelihood, should Maelle be thrust out of the canvas and forced to exist in a way that painted Alicia does, then in all likelihood she may seek to take her own life in the future. Should Maelle lack the support of her Lumiere family, I am not optimistic for what her prospects may be in the long run. And for any of you sitting there saying, if she stays in the painting forever she will die, to that I would say, well, at least she would die surrounded by loved ones and having lived a happy and full life. If the Dessendre family weren't so inconsiderate towards her, maybe I would feel bad for their loss in this scenario, but I truly would only feel for Renoir. Certainly not more so than I would for an entire world being lost, though. And again, I believe that this route is better than her existing on the outside and living in indefinite pain, both physical and emotional, with nobody to support her. So at this point I've covered a lot. But in closing, I want to return us to my main overarching point. The canvas is a tangible and authentic reality, and this indisputable fact makes Maelle's ending not just a matter of sentiment, but of moral necessity. Maelle preserves a rich, interwoven world full of life rather than letting it be erased for one man's personal desire. In choosing Lumiere, she secures a lifelong support system of friends who have repeatedly shown her a love and understanding that would far outweigh the hollowness of returning to a family that blames her for their greatest tragedy. That is why Maelle's ending, grounded in compassion and collective well-being, is the only truly right choice.